Hello ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the demonstration. We're going to be talking about creating black and white photography today in the digital realm. And what this talk is going to kind of boil down to is really the linear capture of RAW and comparing that to film, basically. And we're almost going to debunk the straight out of camera sort of theory or mindset or idea, if you will. But basically, because of the advances in the photographic realm and the technology that we have today, we have an unbelievable amount of control in the capture and manipulation of our images. Now, the talk doesn't necessarily pertain to the experience of a photographer or of a photographer like me or you, or it doesn't really matter, right? It doesn't necessarily matter anything about the concepts of composition or exposure or the perception of light. I'm going to go ahead and kind of assume that those things are taken into account when you're shooting any photograph. The talk is really going to be about, or is about, the syntactic benefits as well as the inherent drawbacks of creating black and white imagery today. Now, we're going to go through the thought process and the technology that we really need to think about or kind of compare our standard RAW captures to is modern film. So as we move throughout our slideshow here of some really fantastic black and white imagery, you'll notice each image has its depth. It has this interesting form to it, and there's something that feels different than just a simple RAW capture. All of those images that we just looked at were all digital photographs. Whether they were shot in a studio or during a snowstorm or with a neutral density filter, it doesn't matter. What all of those photographers had in common is that they were shooting digitally, they got a linear file from that digital capture, and then they had to work with it. Now, the thought process of straight out of camera really rang true, or could have rang true, when we were thinking about film, right? Because when we were working with film, or if you still work with film, and I work with film from time to time, shooting different kinds of black and white film and scanning it to make it digital, and color film as well, but it's different than shooting RAW. Right? Because when we're out there in the field shooting film, we have to pay attention to the color sensitivity, the tonal curve of that particular film, the grain aspect of it, and then the chemical development of that film. In fact, these different aspects are really what gives black and white film the soul that it has, as opposed to a straight digital capture being converted from color to black and white. Now, we could then make our exposures and develop in a certain way when shooting film. The factors, though, that we've got here, I guess what I'm saying is there was a little bit of post-processing when shooting film. You know, there's the chemical development, which allowed you to control in certain ways. There was your tone curve and your color sensitivity. You choose a particular film type based upon a certain situation, as opposed to shooting RAW. Right? Shooting RAW, we're just out in the field. We need to shoot as much data, or in a single capture, we want to get as much data as we possibly can, so that when we are able to massage the image, we can do what we want with it. Now, color sensitivity, or otherwise known as spectral response when shooting black and white film, is how the color of the scene that you're shooting translates into black and white. And so what we've got here is obviously a color photograph. When we convert these images to black and white digitally, it's not going to look like this, or like this, or like this by itself. What we're looking at right now are different color sensitivities. So what's happening is we're actually emulating different film types, but we're able to do that digitally after we make the capture. But as you can see, this black and white process, so here's HP4, it would have reacted this way. Your Plus X125 Pro, and your T-Max at that point. Now, here's the thing. The only thing that you're taking a look at here is the color sensitivity. So it's not taking into account the tone curve or the grain of those particular film types. Those adjustments or those variances that we were seeing were only because of the color sensitivity. Then we have that next variable, which is the tone curve. The tone curve is the measurement of response that the film has to the exposure, and how it relates to the different shadows, midtones, and highlights. So the curve that you see on the left there, the steeper it is, the more contrast that we're going to have between the highlights, the midtones, and the shadows. So here's a curve from an HP4 film. Here's a tone curve from a Plus X 125px Pro. And here's a T-Max. Right? And if you look at the T-Max curve in the lower left-hand corner, on the left-hand side of that curve there, you can see the toe. Right? And notice how the level, or the blacks, the very darkest values on the left-hand side, they're not all the way over against the left-hand side of the histogram, or of the curve itself, the level. So what you're looking at in your image is this very dark black. That's what some film would do. In fact, that's what T-Max would do. As opposed to a Plus X 125px Pro, sort of with a regular development, you're not going to get that much contrast compared to the T-Max. Same goes with the HP4. Right? We have the nice shadow detail, and actually the HP4 has a good amount of contrast as well, but it's different than the other film types. When we're out capturing digitally, these things don't happen in the camera, right? We get a linear capture, unless we're shooting JPEG, but we'll come back to that later on. Now, here's grain, right? And pertaining to grain, in terms of film, that is the light-sensitive silver halide, right? That actually coats the film, which makes up the photographic image on the negative. When we think of grain digitally, and here I've got a couple different versions of this image with lots of grain compared to not so much grain. And these are, of course, digital emulations. But when we think of digital grain, we think of noise. Noise is artifacting. It's typically stuff that we don't want in the image, compared to grain, which was actually the silver that made up the image itself. So there's a disconnect there as well. And digitally, some folks like a lot of grain. Sometimes we don't like a lot of grain. It's a totally subjective sort of thing, but that's kind of besides the point at this conversation anyways. Now then there's the chemical development, and that is by choosing different chemicals, we'll actually change the characteristics of the final negative. In fact, different chemicals with different time developments and different mixtures as well as temperatures will have a dramatic effect on the overall negative. So taking a solvent-based developer like this, which gives you this kind of soft, glowy feel, by changing the temperature and maybe not necessarily developing as long, right? By raising the temperature, but not developing for maybe 6.5 minutes, we develop for 6 minutes, we're going to get a different effect in that chemical development. Now, then there's this sort of process. So the N1 plus 5, N1 plus, or N plus 3, which is going to give us different contrast and different grain structure, as well as your tonal curve is going to be, you're going to get a lot more contrast from an N plus 3 as compared to a 1.5. And one might use that in film to create or to compensate for ISO. Right? Pushing and pulling film and then developing in a certain way would give you different amounts of grain, and one might do that for those reasons. Right? But as you can see, these emulations of the different chemical development, that's the only difference between each one of these exposures. And again, I'm emulating these things. This is not actual piece of film that is being developed in different film types. These are the characteristics of these different kinds of films, different kinds of film chemical developments. Now, the properties of film are one of the reasons why photographers would get so connected to their favorite kind of film and their chemical solutions for development. Right? A lot of photographers would never touch solvent-based film because it created a soft negative and it had a nice glow to it, but it wasn't as sharp. So a lot of photographers wouldn't choose those solvent-based. They would choose something like D76, or maybe combine the D76 with the solvent-based. And the thing is you could use these different combinations to get that soul out of those film images. And in fact, these factors are what really helps to create a consistent style if the photographer sort of sticks with the same chemicals and same development and same film and exposure style as well. Well, shooting digitally is totally different. Right? The raw capture, the raw data that we get is basically linear, which means it doesn't have that nice S-curve. In fact, if we move on to the next slide here, you can see that. In fact, the way that these digital captures work, or the digital sensors and the way that they capture, is that they're trying to make this linear capture so that we get a boatload of information so that we can massage it the way we want to. And this is where that kind of straight out of camera saying is kind of debunked, right? Because when we're shooting raw, this is the curve that we get. It's totally flat. And whether you're dealing with color or black and white, it doesn't necessarily matter. The image, the resulting photo, might be really good straight out of camera, but it could be massaged. It could be adjusted in a way that could make it not necessarily better, but more engaging for the viewer. Right? So what you're seeing right now is the original color representation. It's the raw file with nothing done to it. So here is that exact raw file simply converted from color to black and white. And this is what we would typically get if we just desaturate an image, right? If we just turn it black and white. Now, one of the beauties of shooting raw is that we do get a spot-on representation of what we're shooting, right? And that can be absolutely spectacular and fantastic, but the issue with that is the potential is so wide open, right? The different things that we could do, again, whether we're converting from color to black and white or keeping the image in color, there's so many different things that we could do. It's a lot of times difficult to choose the direction that we might want to take the image. Now, what we're seeing here, the original color image, the black and white conversion, and then a black and white conversion with a film type emulation. Now, I'm not saying that you have to use film types for every black and white conversion. It's just an easy way to display the differences, right? And this image has a lot more soul than the previous black and white. Now, the next one, Panatomic X, this doesn't have any more or any less soul. It's just different, right? Because we chose to take the image in a different direction. But it does have these adjustments that make the image look a bit more engaging. Now, from there, here's the final black and white conversion that I ended up with. But you can see lots of contrast, lots of form, and I try and add some depth with the lines and the direction with the dodging and burning of that those different lines that really help to make the movement in the overall image. Now, what we were getting into is that the raw capture needs that massaging, right? So it's simply a starting point. The raw is the negative, right? And maybe even it's not even the negative, it's before that we even process that negative. So what we get is this sort of blank slate. But we get the blank slate and we're able to look at it, as opposed to film. When we capture the image, if we were to take that film out of the back of the camera, you would be destroying that film, right? You're not able to look at that. When shooting digitally, you're able to look at the initial capture. You can take advantage of all of that data, and then when you convert from color to black and white, you start with this, right, which is simply not necessarily just a desaturation of the image. It's a black and white conversion, but then you can, again, massage it so that you can get exactly what you want. And in this case, I added a little extra grain there. Now, let's see here. Our next set of images. So just a couple examples of the straight color image, a simple black and white conversion. So not doing anything to the image, and as you can see, without massaging the image, it's interesting, but there's not a whole lot of impact. It's not overly engaging, right? As we move to the next slide, here we've got a great photo by John Barclay, and we've got several representations of different things that we could do in black and white. So that's another thing that you can take advantage of. You're starting with the original color data. You can look at it. You can adjust it any number of different ways that you might want to. You're not stuck with any one way, right? And using different tools are going to offer different capabilities. As we go through these different versions of this one image, you can see as the bushes on the side of the road change the tonal values, the road itself changes the toning, the coloring of the image, and these are just simple adjustments. We're not even taking it too awful far. One of the things that you could do is, like I said, start adjusting with different tools. So we had our original color image, we've got our black and white image, and then we've got this version, which is totally different than this version. And as we move to the next one, here we're almost inverting the tones of the bridge itself, and it ends up being lighter than a lot of the values in the sky, which is almost the complete opposite of this, right? And we get to make these choices, but it's a matter of knowing and understanding the software, as well as understanding how these captures are really being made. And getting to know the post-processing tools that you're using is the next mountain that we have to climb. But the fact of the matter is, if we have the original raw data, so we run through these exposures again, if we have the original raw data, we're able to remassage, we're able to change it over again. And in fact, let's say you're working on this image and you convert it and you like what happens once you're done here, but a new piece of software comes out, 3 years from now, or 1 year from now, or whatever, a month from now, you're able to use that next piece of software with your original data, right? And it would be silly to not use those tools and to take advantage of those technological advances. That's just limiting yourself, really. Now, again, I don't mean to sound as though you can't get something great straight out of camera. We should, of course, capture the best information we possibly can when we're shooting our raw images, or when we're shooting JPEG, even if we want to shoot JPEG. But it's really that's that image that you've got, right? The great photo could be massaged, could be adjusted so that you get even something better, right? And I don't mean better, I guess I mean more engaging for the viewer, right? Because this is relatively engaging, maybe. This, as a black and white, which is simply the conversion, isn't so engaging, but as we go in and make these adjustments, all of these other representations are pretty cool. And again, it's completely subjective. But what's really important is that we know that these tools are out there. We don't necessarily take them for granted, and we take advantage of them, and we pay attention to what the different tools can do for us, because that's what ends up being really important. Now, of course, the bane and the beauty of these post-processing tools is that we have to spend the time to learn those tools, which is slightly different than in the film era where, technology would move along, but not nearly as quickly. Right? Every year we seem to be having this new pieces of software come out and brand new cameras that are 1,000 times better than the previous cameras and so on. It's time consuming. It doesn't necessarily have to be. If we pay attention to what we're doing while we're doing it, we can learn even faster. I wouldn't suggest just clicking around all willy-nilly, but I guess what matters is that we enjoy and have fun, right? Even if we're out to make money, and this is how we make money in our living, you have to enjoy what you're doing, and you got into photography for a reason, so hopefully it was to enjoy it. I hope it wasn't just to get in for the money. Anyways, so the stuff that we're talking about here today, we want to make sure that we capture as much information as possible. I would suggest capturing in RAW, which the next slide will actually talk about. Of course, learn the capabilities of whatever your software tools are whatever software tools you're using for your processing. And again, try to pay attention to what's happening. If you can get a histogram on the screen, and you can watch a tone curve change as you make little adjustments to maybe different sliders, or you start adjusting with layer masks within Photoshop or the adjustment brush within Lightroom, pay attention to what each one of those little intricate tools can do for you. And by doing that, you'll learn much, much faster, and you'll be able to see what's happening in black and white or in color, right? Because it doesn't necessarily matter. There are some differences when shooting black and white film, when shooting for black and white, where, you have to pay attention to line and form and depth and lighting, but it's pretty much just as important when you're shooting color anyways. So you definitely pay attention to the color information in the image, because when converting from color to black and white, you're going to be able to utilize that color information with most of the contemporary black and white image editing software. But anyways, the initial RAW file in JPEG. Now, the discussion of RAW in JPEG and whatever battle there seems to be about that, we're not going to get into that. But I want to show you just a quick version or reason why we might suggest shooting RAW compared to JPEG, and that's because what we're looking at right now is a JPEG representation of this fantastic photograph, right? Mind-blowing image. But anyways, the sky is blown out, and the shadow detail underneath the fountain itself is just black, and you can see areas in the image that are completely black. And that's because the dynamic range of the JPEG that comes directly out of our camera is going to be limited compared to the RAW file that would be coming out of the image. But watch this, as we look at the RAW file, the JPEG is actually prettier, right? This has this nice little contrast. It has a little bit more depth to it, and this is what causes confusion, right? Because one might go and look at this JPEG and say, well, you know, it looks a little bit nicer, so why don't we use that? But the thing is this RAW version is going to have a lot more information than that JPEG version is. In fact, you can see it as you look at them side by side. There's absolutely no detail in the sky on the left-hand side image. And there's no detail in parts of the fountain and in parts of the shadow areas of the brush or the little shrubbery and so on. But over on the right-hand side image, although it doesn't have the soul, if you will, of the JPEG, it has more information. It has detail in the sky, and it has detail within the fountain in those black areas. And what that means that we can do is utilize all of that information, right? So sure, straight out of camera, the JPEG might look a little bit better, but we can make a much more engaging image out of the RAW file because there's far more data, right? It goes from an 8-bit to a 16-bit per channel workflow. And also, the camera, when we shoot JPEG, it bakes information into that JPEG. The reason why it has that little bit of extra contrast is because by default, the camera is told by the manufacturer, by whoever developed that software, to add a curve and to maybe adjust the colors. And based upon the different in-camera settings that we use, like let's say we want extra contrast and extra sharpness, that stuff is going to be applied to the JPEG version of the image. It's not going to be applied to the RAW version of the image unless you use the proprietary RAW processing software. So for Nikon, you use Capture NX2, or for Canon, maybe CPP, right? In there, you're able to utilize the RAW data and then use those in-camera capabilities. But if you use any of the Adobe products or Apple's Aperture, that information, that is the in-camera information that's applied to the JPEG, is not used when you're dealing with the RAW file. So the benefit of the RAW is that you get to do it yourself and control it, and you're not sort of limited by whatever the manufacturer says, do it, this is going to work and this is going to be good for you. That's what the JPEG is doing. It's just sort of baking this information in. The RAW file's got far more information. In fact, if we toggle through these three images, here's the JPEG, blown out details, blocked up details. Here's the original RAW, and then here's the original RAW, but RAW processed. Right? And so now you can start to see all of the detail within the sky. We'll start to separating the objects from each other. And yet, still, it doesn't necessarily have the soul that we might want, but that's when we go in and we further process the image. Or in this case, convert from color to black and white, right? Where I'm applying a little extra grain, but look at all of that detail in the sky. And then I've decided to let some of the details go black in the background and in the foreground. But notice in the fountain itself, we can retain all of that detail. Whereas if I try to do that with the JPEG, it wouldn't be there. It doesn't exist. So that's one of the reasons that we might suggest using RAW or capturing in RAW, because it does have far more information in that compared to shooting JPEG right out of camera. Now that said, there are certain situations where JPEG would probably work just fine. When shooting in a very controlled situation, shooting macro or in a studio, maybe, I guess, if you'd want to. You could do that and get away with it, but I definitely would suggest shooting RAW. Now, we've got some very special thanks. I've got a whole bunch of images in this presentation that I used, and I want to make sure that they get proper credit, and I gave copyright in each one, but we had Douglas Saunders, Frank Van Ness, Josh Halftel letting me use some images, Vincent Versace. You can find all these guys and all these people, I should say, on G+ or through their website. Here's Jamie Hayes, and then Todd Hunter Carlson. Very special thank you. And then John Barclay, let me use one of his color images to convert to black and white a whole bunch of different times to show you different representations on that image as well. And then Roy Kirchhoff. And then, of course, a very special thank you to you for watching. Again, my name's Dan Hughes. You can find me on G+ at +Dan Hughes, or through the Nick Software page, or through the hashtag photography page. You'll see me posting through there pretty often as well. But thanks again for watching, ladies and gentlemen. Hopefully this has been beneficial and maybe helped to shed a little bit of light on digital capture. There's tons of information out there on RAW, and I think that's where our next discussion is going to kind of go. So watch out for that, and thanks again for joining.